Being a gamer in China is rough, to say the least, with rules and regulations constantly changing, usually getting more strict, with bans happening left and right. And if you're a kid, it's going to be especially rough. You may have seen the article from back in August 30th, 2021 from Bloomberg that relayed how China recently slashed kids' gaming time to just 3 hours a week, specifically trying to restrict the mobile gaming market and online games as a whole. That a lot of times are 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. on Friday, Saturday, and Sundays, and public holidays. It is a campaign to control the expansion of large tech companies, or so they say. But more than that, the CCP seeks to subjugate its people, to keep them at bay, to ensure that they're behaving exactly in accordance to the CCP's ideals and their Iron Fist rule. And by the way, prior to this latest restriction, there was already a restriction set back in 2019 that limited kids to a mere 1.5 hours of game time per day. Now it's just 1 hour per day during the weekends and during certain public holidays. This has already had a pretty significant impact on companies, as investors were spooked by this, and we saw shares drop in price across numerous Chinese gaming companies, Tencent, NetEase, you name it. Though it should be noted that minors already accounted for a minority of the revenue. So right here, for example, it is stated that Tencent and other companies have said children amount for only a fraction of their businesses, especially after recent restrictions. Revenue from minors yielded less than 3% of its gross gaming receipts in China. Most of the big spenders are, in fact, adults, so this policy isn't necessarily gonna drastically make a dent on these companies. All this new regulation does is punish kids further, suck even more joy out of their lives by limiting their ability to just unwind and have fun. Now, a top-level committee led by President Xi Jinping said that the intention behind these regulations is to prevent the disorderly expansion of some platform companies, and they've said that this endeavor has been successful, while also vowing more transparency and predictability in setting policies. Yes, because when you think of CCP, the two descriptors you think of are transparency and predictability. Xi Jinping also relayed intentions to require anti-monopoly policies to improve China's economy, and he's also placing restrictions on ways that gaming companies can monetize their games. Scrolling down here, Bloomberg bullet pointed some of the other key points in the new rules, and among them is that regulators will ratchet up checks over how gaming firms carry out restrictions on things like playing time and in-game purchases. This is all on top of online games requiring to be linked to a state anti-addiction system and companies not being able to provide services to users without them registering with their real names. And then the last bullet point says that regulators will work with parents, schools, and other members of society to combat youth gaming addiction. China is basically treating video games like they're on the same scale of harmful as drugs and alcohol and all of these vices. Like, literally, the state media at one point called video games spiritual opium. The CCP deems video games to be such a negative influence that they're restricting it as if it were alcohol, drugs, or friggin' gambling. Though, to be fair, there are certain games that should be restricted as such because of their implementation of gambling. They should be rated adults only. FIFA and loot box infused games, I'm looking at all of you. But not all online games are utterly egregious on that front, and they'll be caught in this wide net that China has cast in terms of regulations that essentially restricts kids from gaming almost entirely, like 3 hours per week, 1 hour every day of the weekend. You're not going to get anything done with any video game with that limited playtime. This is very much boomer parent mentality, just complete ignorance on the positive influence that video games had. This is a boomer who happens to be the ruler of this country and has implemented restrictions across the board based on his own ignorance on what video games are and based on his just general need to exert control over his people. That's not to say that kids should be playing games all day, every day. Obviously, things like education and other responsibilities matter, but video games aren't akin to harmful substances. The worst it can do is, you know, waste too much time, if you will, but that's what parents are there for. They're the ones who should be regulating that aspect of things. To cast such a wide net, to punish even kids who are able to play many hours of video games per week and still be responsible and still do well in their education and just still function like a normal kid does, it's about as overkill as you can get. But then again, China's been all about overkill policies that, again, just seek to keep people in line. Now, on top of the additional restrictions on kids' gaming time, China's also slowed down their approval of new online games. So on top of kids being able to game way less, there's just gonna be a significantly reduced output of online games in the coming weeks, months, years, however long this slowing down of approvals will last. Oh, but that's not all. The CCP's crackdown on video games is also trying to influence the kinds of content that can be included in video games. So, for example, here's a PC Gamer headline from 3 days ago that reads, China calls for less effeminate men in video games. So anything outside of pure macho men is not acceptable. So an example provided here by PC Gamer is this character from League of Legends, whose official appearance is this, whereas in China, the character has been changed to look more like this. So more quote-unquote masculine, showing less skin and be less flamboyant and just have shorter hair even. And the Chinese government is very blatant about how much they abhor anything that signals gay, essentially. So in a more recent meeting with companies like Tencent and NetEase, it was reinforced that games with a wrong set of values, including gay love, are to be avoided. They literally call homosexuality a wrong set of values. They call anything outside of the stereotypical macho profile for men being represented in games a wrong set of values. A professor at the University of Hong Kong further explained that this crackdown is driven in part by the perception that effeminate men are physically weak and emotionally fragile and are thus unable to effectively defend the nation from threats. Gaming itself may also be seen by some leaders as contributing to a softening of character in young men. Has the CCP looked in the mirror recently? Has Xi Jinping looked in the mirror? You want to talk about weak, emotionally fragile, soft in character? Look no further than a government who's afraid of video games, who's afraid of homosexuality, who's afraid of men who appear more effeminate. By the Chinese government's definition of what it means to be effeminate, weak, fragile, soft in character, I'd say Xi Jinping is the most effeminate of them all. But yeah, what we're looking at here is full-on censorship, which is nothing new for China, as a result of Xi Jinping's own ignorant and hateful ideals against people who behave or look a certain way. And not to mention the irony of this character, sure, looking more effeminate with all the pink and the rather fabulous armor kit he's got going on here with the attire that he's wearing, but look at him. Does he look weak to you? Does he look soft in character? Does this man with the six-pack and the muscular chests and biceps and triceps and large, bulky figure, does this character, despite being more effeminate, look fragile to you? There's just such narrow-mindedness in the Chinese government. And because of the iron fist they rule with, their narrow-mindedness must apply to all people who must follow these regulations that were bred from just pure ignorance. The one thing I can agree with is companies being instructed to ease up on monetization and profit-focused game mechanics. But outside of that, this is just pure censorship and a limitation on expression. And if you go to the English version of the official Chinese government website, you'll find all of the exact details. Chinese authorities summon online game platforms for talks. Companies like Tencent and NetEase that were asked to profoundly understand the importance of urgency of preventing minors from online game addiction. They should implement relative regulations aimed at boosting youth development. And then down here we have the paragraph that talks about the restrictions on in-game content, obscene and violent content, and those breeding unhealthy tendencies such as money worship and effeminacy should be removed. Effeminacy by the Chinese government is deemed an unhealthy tendency. So they just keep layering restrictions on top of restrictions, each one getting more ridiculous than the last. And this is not surprising for China. This isn't necessarily anything new. But myself and many others living in countries where such ridiculous restrictions are unimaginable, it still kind of shocks the system a bit to see these headlines, to be reminded that there are countries in which the liberties that we may take for granted just aren't present. And when I talk about liberties, I'm not saying countries shouldn't have rules and it should be a free-for-all. There need to be certain regulations in place, but China, as always, takes the nuclear option, takes things way too far. And the unfortunate reality is that unless there is some kind of major revolution, some kind of major shift in the government's leadership, this kind of stuff is going to keep happening. This kind of stuff is going to keep making headlines, and there's really not much that can be done about this currently. And this is just video games we're talking about. Like, this is just scratching the tip of the iceberg in terms of the kinds of restrictions that people have to deal with. But what I can tell you is that I, as a kid, played plenty of video games, multiple hours, and I turned out fine. I did well in school, I did well in my career, I function as a normal human being, and so will the kids in China. Not to say that there aren't nefarious aspects to video games out there, but you can tackle those issues without taking away liberties for an activity that is at its core just fun and engaging and immersive and expressive. And as for this whole notion that effeminate men shouldn't be in video games because effeminacy means being weaker, being softer, being more fragile, I mean, do I even need to clarify this? I've met people across the entire gender spectrum who would utterly demolish me in physical strength and have incredible willpower. It's just complete ignorance to assume that there is a direct correlation between strength and how effeminate one is. And just this whole notion of society defining who men should be and who women should be instead of just letting people be who they want to be. Again, an antiquated, very boomer way of thinking. But alas, here we are, and these are the latest developments surrounding gaming restrictions in China. And this is one man's take. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on all of this. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.